not the only one sick.
I've noticed actually, Grant, there's a lot of.
I had a sore throat, but I don't anymore.
I don't feel bad. It's just my voice sounds horrible, and I just had a cold. But I don't feel. I feel fine. Yeah. Okay. Okay. We have started chapter 7, and remembered up to this point, we're going to be talking about cells. And one thing we've covered so far is there are 2 major types of cells that are considered living. You have your prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Definitely know the difference. Prokaryotes, simple, like bacteria. Eukaryotic cells, a little more complex. To be honest, when it comes to the 6 kingdoms of life, most of those kingdoms fall in the eukaryotic range. All your plant cells, all your animal cells, all your fungi cells, all your protist cells. All of those are basically eukaryotic cells. They all have a lot of pieces, parts to them. It's pretty much just your 2 bacterial kingdoms that are considered prokaryotic. They're real simple cells. Remember, the big difference between the 2 cells is that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus. Prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotic cells do. So we've already covered all of that so far. Today we're going to start going into the details about all those parts of a cell. All those parts of a cell. And I think I put this up there before, but I want to stress something. We're going to be talking about a ton of different organelles, a ton of different parts of a cell. Okay, now don't lose sight in the fact that they all work together, kind of like you see in this picture. Okay, granted, there are, again, little men or little forklifts in your cells, but understand the point of this was just that all these parts are working together for the same goal. What's that goal? They're little factories. Every cell is a little factory. What do factories do? They make stuff. What do cells make? They make those 4 major macromolecules that we need to live. They make proteins. They make carbohydrates. They make lipids. They make nucleic acids. All those things that living organisms are made of. They got to come from somewhere. Where do they come from? The cells make them. So that's why I like this, because they refer to a cell as a factory. And the nice thing is that when we talk about all these parts of a cell, they're all different parts of the factory. So keep that in mind, and we're going to try to have you remember all these parts based on that idea that they all have kind of a place in the factory. Okay. I used this word already. I want to be sure you know what it means. Organelle. Well, just like inside of us, we have a bunch of organs, like heart and muscle, and or heart and liver, or pancreas, or whatever. An organelle is some kind of internal structure of a cell. Kind of like an organ is an internal structure of us. An organelle is an internal structure of a cell. Organelles have a specific job that they're meant to do. Just like if you worked at a factory, you'd have a specific job. All right, let's start talking about the organelles then. Let's start off with, I think, the most important part of a cell. The plasma membrane. By the way, I'm going to put the word all cells here, because I don't care if you're a prokaryote or a eukaryote, every cell that's considered living has a plasma membrane. They have a job. Control what enters or leaves the cell. Okay, well, let's relate this to our factory. If there's a factory that makes something like real top secret or real dangerous, a lot of times those factories will have security gates. Everybody has to enter and leave at the same place. That's kind of what the plasma membrane does. It controls what enters or leaves the cell. There's a word, though. It doesn't just let anybody in. I know it's a big word, but it's a very important word. Selectively permeable. Ooh. Big word, but let's break it down. Selectively. Selective. Well, if you guys are selective about something, you're choosy. Okay, well, plasma membranes sure are. They don't want to let just anybody in. They're choosy. Permeable. Ability to pass through something. Choosy about what it moves through. In other words, the word selectively permeable refers to the fact that the plasma membrane is very picky about what it lets in and out. Let me kind of give you a little idea about the types of stuff that needs to come in and out of a cell. I think that's actually a good point. We're going to see over the next couple of chapters, we're going to want oxygen, O2, to come into our cell. We're going to want things like glucose to enter the cell, too. We're going to want to get rid of things like CO2, which is like a waste product of a cell. Because if too much CO2 builds up in the cell, you're a goner. It's toxic. The plasma membrane also better control water, which is going to kind of go both ways. Later on in the chapter, we're going to be talking about this word osmosis, which I know you've heard that word before, which is going to refer to the process where this water goes back and forth. But for now, just understand this. Plasma membranes are selectively permeable. Means that they're real picky about what they want to come in and out of the cell. I don't know about you guys, but I'm real picky. I hope my cells are pretty picky about what comes in and out of them. They've got to be. They can't just let any old thing in. Well, how exactly do they do that? Select plasma membranes. Before I write it, let me show you a picture of a plasma membrane. They're pretty cool looking. Okay, try to ignore the words and just look at the picture. Because the words are, just ignore those for now. You got to imagine, this is just like a section of a plasma membrane. You got to imagine this would go wrap all the way around a cell. Okay, this would basically be the outer layer all the way around. And at first glance, you notice that there's two layers of something. Okay, well, we'll talk, those pink things, you can tell from this picture, that's basically most of the cell. And we're going to talk about what those things are. Those things are phospholipids. Okay, actually, I think even in the last chapter, I might have even drawn a picture of a phospholipid. It was like a balloon with two tails. You can even see that's kind of what they are in this picture. It's like a little pink balloon with two tails. It's called a phospholipid. I want you to know that. It's a type of fat. It's a lipid. This is why fats are actually needed in our diet. Think about it. They make up pretty much the plasma membrane around every one of our cells. Okay, you definitely need fat in your diet. So the pink things. You also see some of these green things. Those green things are proteins. Now those proteins, I know it's I keep saying that we are big bags of proteins. Well, there's yet another example of where proteins are found in the body. They are basically dotted all over the plasma membrane of every cell. Now those proteins have some jobs to do, and there's different jobs. Some of those green proteins, some of those proteins are able to transport things across them. Some of those proteins have a different job of being little receptor cells, which are out there figuring out what stuff out in the world of around them is good and which things are bad. Little receptors. So those green things are protein. That's another big part of the plasma membrane. You also have cholesterol. Weird. I thought cholesterol was bad. No. In fact, cholesterol is a very, very needed part inside of you. Too much is bad, yes. But some cholesterol is actually a pretty big part of the plasma membrane. It acts like glue. Kind of makes sense because cholesterol is real sticky, but cholesterol acts like glue to kind of keep these parts kind of wrapped together. And, carbohydrates. Kind of a smaller part of the cell. You have these little they're represented by these little pink, other purpley, like darker pink things. Those are kind of used to recognize whether something is good or bad in the outside world kind of deal. So, all right. I like this picture. Let me show you a couple more because you see some other pictures. Same idea. It's showing plasma membrane just from a different book. Here they kind of show you an actual up-close look at what one of those phospholipids looks like. Again, that's like the main part of this plasma membrane. In this picture, they're showing those phospholipids as kind of like orangey. And then they have these blue and purple proteins kind of dotted in there as well. You also see, you don't see the cholesterol in this picture though. They don't show the cholesterol in this particular picture, but they do show those carbohydrates. And I think I have one more. Just a different kind of view. Cell membrane. They're showing a phospholipid. Now the phospholipids are yellow. They have pink or purple little proteins. Plasma membranes are pretty complex. They gotta be. They've gotta be designed to be complex because they've gotta be really picky about what they let in and out. So I'm hoping they're complex. Okay, here's some key points I want you to know about the plasma membrane. Made up of phospholipids. Well, look at the word. It's a lipid. Made up of these proteins. And I'm going to put the word transport below it because the majority of these proteins are like little transportation systems to move stuff in and out of the cell. Cholesterol. Not all cholesterol is bad. And carbohydrates. Okay, check it out, guys. Last chapter, we talked about the 4 major macromolecules found in living organisms are proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids. Well, 3 of the 4 are found in your plasma membranes alone. So, all right. Oh, other details. I do want you guys to know, if I probably wrote it last chapter, but if I didn't, this would be a general structure of a phospholipid. I want you guys to realize that there is both a polar and a non-polar portion to a phospholipid. Okay, all that means is that when it comes to a phospholipid molecule, part of it has a charge, the polar part, and part of it doesn't have a charge, the non-polar part of it. When you throw a bunch of these phospholipids into water, which makes up most of the insides of living organisms, they naturally form that 2-layer look to them. The non-polar portions, the tails, hook up. And the polar heads basically are kind of on the outside. Okay, I know you're like, why are you focusing so much on this? That's the reason the plasma membrane is so picky. It's because of these phospholipids having both this polar and non-polar part to them. Think of water as being polar and think of oil as being non-polar. You know what happens when you throw oil in a bunch of water? It all kind of goes in a big clump all by themselves. The oil just does not want to be around the water. That's exactly what's happening here. All those non-polar tails are basically hooking up together just like beads of oil would in some water. Very similar. And that's the natural shape they take. So it basically forms what's called a lipid bilayer. I know there's all these big words when it comes to the plasma membrane. Lipid, fat, bi-2 layer. 2 fat layer. That's why you have 2 of these molecules. All right. Pretty cool stuff, that plasma plasma membrane is. All right, next thing I want to talk about is the nucleus. Now remember, this is only found in eukaryotes. Eukaryotes only. Bacterial and all those other prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotes do. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. Why is it the control center? Because it contains the DNA. Every cell that makes up a living organism has a piece of DNA in it. And in eukaryotes, that's in the nucleus. So if I have a picture of a big giant cell right here, it's going to have this separate compartment. That's the nucleus. And inside the nucleus is going to contain the DNA. I want to say one more word about DNA. But before I say a word about DNA, you need an art lesson. I'm going to give you an art lesson, guys. That's a joke, right? I want you guys to learn how to draw a DNA molecule because you'll be drawing a lot of them this year. Okay, here's how you do it. Draw one squiggly line, kind of like wavy, like that. Then draw another one completely opposite it, like start from the other direction. Okay? And then everywhere you kind of see that enclosed, just draw your little steps of the ladder. That is a DNA molecule. Well, that's, sort of kind of what one looks like. Okay, one more word about DNA. That's what you can even label that. That's DNA. DNA is really, really long. You guys, like I said, in every one of the cells of living organisms, you have this piece of DNA, and it is extremely long. 3 billion steps long. Huge. You can kind of break up a piece of DNA into parts. Each of those parts is called a gene. I know you guys have heard this word before. The gene for that disease, or the gene for this disease, or the gene for eye color. You've heard of that before. All a gene is just a small portion of the DNA that's going to go on to code for some protein. Okay, hopefully I didn't lose you on that. Maybe this part of DNA, that gene, codes for the protein that's going to give me green eyes. Maybe this gene down here codes for the protein that's going to go and make up part of my skin. Maybe this gene codes for a protein, which is going to become an enzyme to help me break down that lunch I ate earlier today. See how basically the nucleus is going to contain this piece of DNA, which is like a blueprint, which is going to go on and code for basically everything about a living organism. Okay. All right, so that's it with the nucleus. Control center of the cell contains the DNA. A couple other easy words, and I'll stop for the day. Cytoplasm. By the way, the word cyto means cell. So anytime you're going to see the word cyto a lot in this chapter. This word cyto means cell. Well, plasm is just kind of as the word looks like. It's just goo. Cytoplasm is basically the liquid portion inside of a cell. Literally, it's just kind of like the goo that all the other organelles are suspended in. It's like a fluid. Oh, by the way, all cells have a cytoplasm. All cells have cytoplasm. Don't care what you are, prokaryote, eukaryote, you all do. Cytoskeleton. Eukaryotes only. Well, this one's easy too. Look at the word. Cyto, cell. Skeleton, well, we all know what a skeleton is. But in a cell, it's not like our bones. It's basically it's a network of protein fibers. In other words, don't consider the skeleton inside of a cell like really rigid, hard bone. It's more like these kind of fibery thread-like proteins. Tell you what, the cytoskeleton inside of a cell is much cooler than our skeleton. Our skeleton can't change shape. You know, my leg bones are going to remain the same shape for the rest of my life. In a cell, though, the cytoskeleton is so much better because it can kind of break and reform as needed. That's why cells have this cool ability to change shape. Oh, how cool would that be if our skeletons were able to kind of change shape? It would be awesome. It would be like you could morph into some other, you know, kind of shape. It would be kind of neat. So anyway, we have covered just the, 4 parts of the cell: the plasma membrane, the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the cytoskeleton. Okay. I want to show you a video clip now, and it has to do with this. It has to do with cystic fibrosis. And you're like, wait a minute, what does cystic fibrosis have to do with parts of the cell? Well, it does have to do with it. Let me show you why. Plasma membrane. Remember how I told you that your plasma membrane has a bunch of proteins in it, the green things. Okay, and those proteins, a lot of times, those proteins in the plasma membrane have the job of moving things back and forth through them. Okay. Remember how I also told you today that you have a piece of DNA, and that DNA can be broken up into genes that make a certain protein. Well, your DNA is ultimately responsible for making these proteins. If your DNA has something wrong with it, it's not going to make the right protein. In the case of cystic fibrosis, you have a boo-boo in your DNA, a mistake in your DNA from birth. It's a genetic disorder. Genetic disorders are all the same. There's a defect in your DNA. Something's wrong with your DNA. This particular gene in people with cystic fibrosis, the particular gene is supposed to code for a protein that's going to move salts back and forth in and out of the cell. Well, if that protein isn't working right, it's not going to be able to move salts back and forth properly across the cell. What happens in people with cystic fibrosis is the salt gets trapped inside of the cell, can't get out. And what ends up happening as a result, a bunch of things happen, but what ends up happening is a film of mucus coats all your cells. Your lung cells are particularly susceptible to this. So what happens with people with cystic fibrosis is they have respiratory problems. The babies actually, you have to pat them on the back a certain way to get the mucus out because they're accumulating so much mucus in their lung cells. So a lot of times they have shorter lifespans. So let me kind of show you this video. It's kind of interesting. It kind of is a nice video showing how, yeah, it does matter learning the parts of the cell. Because if something doesn't get made properly, I mean, there's a lot of parts here. If something doesn't get made properly, it could really, 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 it could cause a lot of problems. Oops, my mistake. Oh. Oh, you've been showing AP biology pictures. Wouldn't have been all bad. Hey, guys, by the way, for the record. Oh, I should. You know what? I'll have time. Remind me to do that. I'm going to show you guys how to play games. Okay. By the way, this whole movie, this is just a short, like 10-minute clip from this movie called Cracking the Code of Life. It's a movie about DNA, and basically the whole movie is about how these scientists have actually decoded human DNA. In other words, they've taken a piece of human DNA and they know where every gene is and what every gene does. It was a cool project. Anyway, so I want you guys to...
It was the whole point, right? But if there is one thing that the Human Genome Project has taught us, it's that finding cures is a whole lot harder than simply reading letters of DNA. Take, for example, the case of little Riley Dimanche. At 2 months, Riley appears to be a perfectly healthy baby boy, but he's not. When Riley was just 13 days old, Kathy Dimanche got the call that every parent dreads.
The pediatrician called on a Thursday evening, and he said, I need to talk to you about the baby. He said, are you sitting down? And I'm like, yeah, and that really surprised me. And he said, are you holding the baby? Because he didn't want me to drop the baby, obviously. And he said that tests came through and Riley tested positive to cystic fibrosis. And I was in shock.
As Kathy and her husband would soon learn, cystic fibrosis, CF for short, attacks several organs of the body, but especially the lungs. Its victims suffer from chronic respiratory infections, and half of all CF patients die before the age of 30.
Sounds good.
Good.
But I think we can still be hopeful that their child will grow up to have a normal, healthy, happy, and long life. But at the present time, I don't have any guarantees about that.
Someone had asked me, are you prepared to bury your son at such a young age, whether it's 4 or 40? And he was 17 days old when that happened. And I said, I've had him for 17 days. I wouldn't trade those 17 days.
Finding the genetic defect that causes CF was big news back in 1989.
Medical researchers say they have discovered the gene which is responsible for cystic fibrosis, the most common inherited fatal disease in this country.
We're going to cure this disease.
A lot of people expected the cure to arrive any day. It didn't. Francis Collins, now head of the government's Genome Project, led one of the teams that discovered the CF gene.
We still have not seen this disease cured or even particularly benefited by all of this wonderful molecular biology. CF is still treated pretty much the way it was 10 years ago, but that is going to change.
The original hope was that babies like Riley could be cured by gene therapy, medicine that would provide a good working copy of a broken gene. But attempts at gene therapy have hardly ever worked. They remain highly controversial, so if there's going to be an effective treatment for Riley, instead of fixing his genes, we're going to take a look, and this is new territory, at his proteins.
What do proteins do? When you look at yourself in the mirror, you don't see DNA, you don't see RNA. You see proteins and the result of protein action. That's what we are physically composed of.
So it's not a Rodgers and Hammerstein thing where one guy does the tune and the other guy does the lyrics. This is a case where the genes create the proteins and the proteins create us.
That's right. We are the accumulation of our proteins and our protein activities.
A protein starts out as a long chain of different chemicals, amino acids, but unlike genes, proteins won't work in a straight line.
Genes are effectively one-dimensional. If you write down the sequence of A, C, G, and T, that's kind of what you need to know about that gene. But proteins are three-dimensional. They have to be, because we're three-dimensional and we're made of those proteins. Otherwise, we'd all sort of be linear, unimaginably weird creatures.
Here's part of a protein. Think of them as tangles of ribbon. They come in any number of different shapes. They can look like this, or like this, or this. The varieties are endless. But when it's created, every protein is told, here is your shape. And that shape defines what it does, tells all the other proteins what it does, and that's how they recognize each other when they hook up and do business. In the protein world, your shape is your destiny.
They have needs and reasons to want to be snuggled up against each other in a particular way. And actually, a particular amino acid sequence will almost always fold in a precise way.
Should I think origami-like? I mean, should I think folding and then...
It's very elegant, very complicated, and we still do not have the ability to precisely predict how that's going to work. But obviously it does work.
Except, of course, if something does go wrong. And that's what happened to baby Riley. Riley has a tiny error in his DNA. Just 3 letters out of 3 billion are missing. But because of that error, he has a faulty gene. And that faulty gene creates a faulty or misshapen protein. And just the slightest little changes in shape, and boom, the consequences are huge. Because it is now misshapen, and a key protein that's found in lung cells, in fact in many cells, can't do its job. So let's take a look at some real lung cells. We'll travel in. This is the lining or the membrane of a lung cell, and here's how the protein is supposed to work. The top of your screen is the outside of a cell, the bottom of the screen, the inside of the cell, of course, and our healthy protein is providing a kind of chute so that salt can enter and leave the cell. Those little green bubbles, that's salt. And as you see here, the salt is getting through. But if the protein is not the right shape, then it's not allowed into the membrane. It can't do its job. And without that protein, as you see here, salt gets trapped inside the cell, and that triggers a whole chain of reactions that makes the cell surface sticky and covered with thick mucus.
The first 2 positions that are done sitting up are probably a little more difficult to do.
That mucus has to be dislodged physically.
Just kind of like that.
Riley's family is learning to loosen the mucus that may develop in his lungs and fight infections with antibiotics.
You want to sort of do it with a cupped hand.
Trying to get at the top of the lung.
Yeah, if you want to be like... Right.
But what the doctors and the scientists would love to do is, if they can't fix baby Riley's genes, then maybe there's some way to treat Riley's misshapen protein and restore the original shape. Because if you could just get them shaped right, the protein should become instantly recognizable to other proteins and get back to business. But look at these things. How would we ever learn? There's some way to treat Riley's misshapen protein and restore the original shape. Because if you could just get them shaped right, the protein should become instantly recognizable to other proteins and get back.
Okay. The reason I wanted to stop this is, even though the picture looks different, this is a plasma membrane. You know, most of these things are probably phospholipids here. Okay, but this is an example, kind of like an animated look at what a protein would be. And like I said, these proteins are so important. They transport things. In the case of cystic fibrosis, bad gene makes a bad protein. This bad protein can't go on and do its job. Interesting, I think. So, questions on any of that? Does anybody know anybody with cystic fibrosis? I know somebody in the other class kind of did, so kind of interesting. Cool. Plasma membrane is a pretty interesting part of a cell. So, okay. Hey, while I have your attention up here on the screen, I want you guys to show you guys something.